Hey guys, welcome to the White Book Podcast. This is Will Lentz, also known as Kenan on forums and the like online, host and I guess you could say creator of the show, at least the most stalwart person here for 300 episodes. We're starting out some video content with a re-release of an interview that we did with George R. R. Martin the very first weekend we started this show, way back in 2011. So I do apologize. The audio is very rough. It was recorded on a phone. This particular version here, we have run through a voice-to-text transcription software. So it is the raw, uncut footage and audio here so that you can see all of the funny gaffes that it makes attempting to translate that. You will hear another podcast listed, the Bear Swarm podcast, another podcast that some buddies did. Unfortunately, we had them also in on the interview. I only say unfortunately because, doggone it, we outnumbered them, so to speak, on the interview. Two of us hosting from what was at that point Two Champs and a Chump, later became the White Book, versus only one Bear Swarm host. So why in the world we let them say their podcast name instead of ours? I just don't remember at this point. But regardless, enjoy the interview and a little bit of reminiscing about the state of George R. R. Martin's writings and the media surrounding it just before season 1 of the show launched. Enjoy, and be sure to check out the White Book Podcast. Over 300 episodes now of info and insight on the Game of Thrones living card game from Fantasy Flight Games.
Okay, the bear swarm, bear swarm, like bears in the woods. Yeah, swarming like bees. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's what we got. All right. This is Paul from the Bear Swarm. We're here with George R. R. Martin just to kind of chat with him for a bit. Nothing too serious, just something for you guys to listen to. So we've been here in Minneapolis, the days of Ice and Fire. He was the guest of honor. Okay, let's get it started. I'll go ahead and just start with a question about your characters. Obviously, I know writers tend to inject a bit of themselves in their characters. Well, you write what you know. Is there any particular character that you've maybe put a little more of yourself into? I'm often asked who's my favorite character, and the answer is usually Tyrion. So you could say that, although I'm significantly different from Tyrion in a lot of ways as well. But you're right. I mean, I think there's some of me in all of the characters, even the ones who seem on the surface to be utterly different from me, like the women or the hideous villains or the sorcerers or what have you. In an existential sense here, the only one we ever really know inside and out is ourselves. So any writer who wants to do fully fleshed out three-dimensional characters has to dig deep, has to look inside to try to understand human motivations, hopefully tempered with a bit of empathy and a certain amount of imagination, where you're saying, well, all right, what would it be like if I was an 8-year-old girl? What would it be like if I was an exile in a distant land? What would it be like if I was a dwarf? And try to put yourself, but you're still starting with yourself as the basis. But I also take inspiration from characters from friends and people in the news, acquaintances, people I read about in history. things that they had done or said, or perhaps written about themselves in autobiographies. All of that becomes grist for the mill.
Yeah. Well, conversely, is there anyone that's particularly difficult for you to put yourself into their mindset and write about?
Well, the hardest character to write about is Bran, simply because he is the youngest character. He is the youngest. I have a number of children as characters, and Bran was the youngest of those that I've actually attempted to write about as a viewpoint thing. So I don't actually have any children, so I don't have any little examples running around my house to observe. I was a child once, but it was a long time ago, and I can try to remember what it was like. But when you're writing about a young child and you're inside his head, you really have to examine every word, every scene very, very carefully, because you have to ask yourself, well, would he see it that way? Would he understand, okay, he's present here, and he's hearing these words. Does he understand these words? Does he understand what he's seeing? How does he perceive the world? What level of sophistication is that? And you have to examine every sentence that way. And it's a tricky process. And with Bran, I don't want to spoil anything in the book, but at a certain point, he becomes severely limited in the actions he can take, and therefore there's a certain enforced passivity too that makes him more of an observer than an actor, and that's also a bit of a challenge. So Bran is the hardest character to write about, but I do find that rewarding too, especially when I slog on through and get a good result.
Yeah, good. You had mentioned drawing upon historical figures for inspiration, and of course, maybe it's just me, but I kind of see a lot of. I heard you mention, I believe yesterday, the British Wars of the Roses.
The Wars of the Roses, yes, it's certainly been one of the major influences, along with the 100 Years' War, the Crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, and some other incidents and periods in history. The Dothraki. What exactly did you have in mind for them? I kind of get kind of flashes of Mongolians, maybe even American Indians. Yes, they are that. I don't want to do with any of my historical references. I don't like to do one-to-one things. I don't like to just take a figure from history and erase his name and give him a new fantasy name, but he's exactly the same as the figure from history, and he goes through the same things. I like to mix and match and sort of take, you want the historical thing because it grounds you. It gives you something that'll help make it a little more gritty and realistic. But then you want to maybe take something from this character and something from that character and add a twist or an element of imagination, and you get hopefully a new character who can be seen to be influenced by these historical figures, but is different. And that's certainly true with the Dothraki. I mean, many people have equated them with the Mongols of Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde and all that, and certainly there's a lot of that there, but they're not just the Mongols. They're significantly different from the Mongols in a number of ways, in their religion and in their level of technological sophistication in their history. I've also borrowed from them from certain of the other steppe peoples of the Great Eurasian Steppe, the Alans, who preceded the Mongols, the Huns, who were, of course, 1,000 years earlier, and then, as you say, the Amerindian tribes of the American plains, the Cheyenne and the Sioux, and to that I've added a fantasy element. I've added some twists that was not true of any of those peoples, but is true of my Dothraki. So hopefully make them a people who are inspired by all of these things, but have their own fictional, fantastic identity.
Yeah. You were speaking yesterday during the Q&A a little bit about Arya's name,
right,
and the kind of the qualities that you were looking for in that name, the kind of knife-like cutting sound. There are other names in the series that are real-world names. Robert, There are others that are similar. Like you could almost see a descent or a corruption of names that we would normally hear, Eddard and things along those lines. Just you spend a lot of time working out heraldry and the like. Do you work a similar way with names, some of the related sounding ones like that?
Well, I've certainly spent a lot of time, fiddling with the names and trying to get the names right. I do think names are important. If you have a name that rings false, it can take the reader out of the book. There are several challenges here. The whole issue of names is a big one. I think I was talking yesterday about the sort of rule that they teach a lot of young writers in workshops and all that, where they tell you, well, you should never in a story have two characters whose name begins with the same letter, because the reader will get that confused as they're not reading aloud, they're just looking, they see an R, and so if you have a Robert and a Raymond, they may get them mixed up. Which is fine as far as this goes. It's a rule that I followed for many years in my short stories and some of my other works. But then I start something like Ice and Fire, and of course I realized very quickly that I'm going to have more than 26 characters. So there goes that rule right there.
Yeah.
And you certainly the corollary to that rule is never have two characters who have the same name. That's even worse than beginning with the same letter. But again, reading history, I said, people who study history don't seem to have any trouble telling Edward III first from Edward II, from Edward III, from Edward IV, etc. So why should fantasy readers be assumed to be more stupid than that? I think the history shows us that these names will be used, and it has a nice medieval ring to it. If you look at English history, it's all Edwards and Henrys and an occasional Richard sneaking in, and you look over to the French, and it's all Louis and Phillips, etc. And that was also true of many of the noble families below the royal thing. They tended to use the same names over and over again. There was that sense of, this is our traditional family name, and I wanted that sense of tradition, so I did it that way. I also wanted the names to reflect, Westeros has a long and complicated history where it was originally, there was the non-human race, the children of the forest, and the first men came in, and then they built the civilization, and then the Andals crossed the water and pushed aside most of the first men, toppled most of their kingdoms. The Rhoynar came in just in the south, and latest of all, the Targaryens, who are descended from ancient Valyria. Each of these is a completely different cultural ethnic group. Each one would have a different pattern of names. So I tried to reflect that in the names of the various families and all that. If you see a name like Stark or Strong or Mudd, that's a first men. Their names are simple, descriptive kind of things. The Andal names tend to be more fanciful, like Arryn or Lannister, and then you get the Targaryens with their very long, complicated Valyrian names, frequently including AEs and Ys and that sort of thing. So I was going for all of that.
Interesting that you mentioned that about the northerly names, Stark and Mudd and Strong and the like. I actually had an English professor talking about telling what words had descended from the German or the French influences or Latinate by the number of syllables. Not a hard and fast rule, but it's interesting. I hadn't made that connection there with the naming scheme in your books.
I try to avoid names. I have used some names. Sometimes I take a real life name like Robert, and I twist it with Robett, like Robett Glover, Robett. But sometimes I spell it the normal way, like Robert Baratheon. They're slightly different forms of the same name. I mean, if you look at the real life Middle Ages, they weren't really consistent on the whole idea of spelling. We have like 7 examples of William Shakespeare's signature, and every one he spells it differently. So I tried to have a little fun with that, reflecting that there. I got into an argument about this once at a convention where I was talking about this very naming issue with a woman who was a linguist and at a local university, and I said, I tried to use any names that have an ethnic connotation, because if you name someone Pierre, you automatically think French, and we have no French people in this world. It's an imaginary world. There's no country called France. And she said, well, but you violated that because you have Robert and these names also have ethnic origins. And that's true, of course. Technically, she's right, but I think effectively she's wrong, because I think for modern American readers and British readers, we tend to think of Robert, and we don't think of them as ethnic names. We think of them as, I don't know, the default names of our culture, Robert and Edward and Richard and things like that. So you use those names and they don't evoke any particular ethnic group that leaps out. Like if you name someone Guido, and they say, well, where did this Italian wander into this fantasy? But it's difficult, actually. And especially a book as big as A Song of Ice and Fire, because I chew up names by the cartload. There are so many characters, so many secondary and tertiary characters, and they all need names. Yeah. So I'm always having to think of another one, and sometimes I get one that just doesn't ring right, and I pick at it like something caught between your teeth, I got the name in there, and I'm working on the book, and yet every time I come on that character, something bothers me about it, and finally I come up with something different and substitute it.
I have a question about my favorite, not even tertiary character.
I'm glad you are going to ask. I wondered what.
Dick and Manwoody. Was that on purpose?
It's been so long ago. I came across that name somewhere. I don't remember where now. Manwoody. Mm-hmm. I mean, Dickon, of course, was a common Middle Ages nickname or variant for Richard. Mm-hmm. Dickon, Rickon. There were things like that. But I don't know where I encountered the name Manwoody, but it just seemed cool. So yeah, I threw it in there.
Yeah, it's a very, they have like very impressive house, like their heraldry, their castle is called Kingsgrave, right. And then Dick and Manwoody. You
can't hear that name and not laugh.
Yeah.
There are some of the names of the minor characters who are my homages to other fantasy writers or other people that I admire. They're not going to be major characters. They're sort of background characters. But there's actually two branches of House Vance, which is my tip of the hat to Jack Vance, one of the great fantasists of our time and science fiction writers of our time, whose work has been tremendously influential on, I think, not just me, but a whole generation of science fiction and fantasy writers. And similarly, there's a House Rogers, which is for my friend Rogers, the late Roger Slasny, and there's a House Jourdain of the Tour, which is for my friend Robert Jordan. And they're just background things, but it's just my way of nodding to some fellow fantasists.
We actually very big fans of the games that have been based out of your imagination, I suppose. Currently play the Song of Ice and Fire role-playing game twice weekly,
so the new one from Green Ronin, or the old one from Guardians of Water?
The new one from Green Ronin right now, although the old version is probably the best looking role-playing game book I've ever seen. Yeah. It's very impressive.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book. It's a shame that they went bankrupt after publishing it.
I actually have a copy of the older book. Couldn't find anybody to play that version with me, but yeah, the new version we enjoy immensely. How much input, obviously when somebody is using your creative or your intellectual property and kind of tinkering around with it. Obviously, weird things can happen, but how much kind of direct input do you have in these things?
Well, I have some. All of my contracts for secondary rights contain certain approval clauses. The question is, to what extent do I exercise the approval? Now, in the case of games, I tend to let the games company do, whatever they want with the rules and all that. I'm not, although I have gamed and I have been a gamer and I've enjoyed various kinds of games, from board games, role-playing games, whatever. I am not an expert on game design or anything like that, so I leave that to the expert. They can design, what they call the crunchy bits, I guess.
Yeah.
I want to have a certain amount of review and approval of the text and the stuff you're saying about the world, and particularly of the art. That being said, I really have had to pull back since the early days. We're doing this here at Fantasy Flight's Wonderful Days of Ice and Fire, and Fantasy Flight has done some of the best games of the things. They're collectible card game and board game and the new living card game. And the card games in particular generated an enormous amount of art.
Yeah.
And when we first started this, they were sending me every card, and I was reviewing every card, and I was writing like paragraph-long critiques of every card. And it was great, but, I know this world so well that I'm sure I was driving the poor guys at Fantasy Flight crazy with, my nitpicking, oh, no, he has the shade of color of his cloak is not quite right. And, these buttons on his jacket, I don't like them. And, that kind of thing is too fussy. And not only that, it was eating up so much of my time. I realized after a few months of this that this way lay madness, both for them and for me. So I pulled back, and I don't review any of the generic cards anymore, the ones that are just like Treachery or, the Rose Road or a merchant ship, that kind of card. The ones that particularly show my characters or scenes or castles, I do try to review. Even then, between Green Ronin and Fantasy Flight and my other licensees from out of the games area, like the Dark Sword miniatures or the Valerian Steel replica weapons, the Valerian resin mini busts, there's a lot of stuff to review, and sometimes it's very hard for me to keep up and write these books at the same time. So I'm really kind of torn on this point. I like to be part of the process. I like to guarantee that, to the extent that I can, that the products that come out really reflect the world of Westeros and will not be a disappointment. I don't want to be one of these guys who just sells the license and cashes the check. But I can't be. If I was involved to the extent that I want to be, I'd never get any writing done. And as you know, I'm kind of late already. So I don't know. I try to do the best I can in that regard.
All right, and a listener of the show wanted me to ask this question to you as well. If Jerry Jones were a Westeros character, owner of the Cowboys, obviously.
The spy. You can't tell me any football scores, though. I've been away traveling. I've TiVo'd all the game. I don't know anything that's happened in the last 4 months.
I've been keeping track of the scores. I was going to ask you after the interview if you were interested.
No. No, you must keep them all secret. So I'm going to go home and I'm going to watch all my games on TiVo. So a month worth of Giants and Jets games.
Yeah.
But Jerry Jones is scum. So I don't know who would be the appropriately scummy person to be in Westeros.
I kind of thought Walter Fry, but that was kind of my natural inclination.
I could see that. Yeah.
Well, connected, I guess, to the art, O'Kane, and the like. I know you said you're kind of limited on what you can say about the HBO series, but hopefully this is something you can say a little on. I'm thinking you likely had a similar okay on the actors, and if so,
no, you're wrong about that. You're dealing with a different order of magnitude when you're dealing with Hollywood. Unless you're J.K. Rowling, nobody gets approval. That's usually a deal killer. If you can get it, if you're J.K. Rowling, but maybe for Stephen King, but not for anything short of that. And as well as my books do, I'm not at that level yet. So I had a consultation. I viewed all of the editions. I put in my 2 cents worth on the actors, but I don't have any kind of veto power or approval on the actors or the set design or anything like that. I'm just one voice among many saying, well, this is my thought. I like this actor. I didn't like this one, etc. And sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't. And, there are a dozen other people whose voices are just as important as mine in the complicated process of putting together a television series.
Yeah. Anything that you're particularly excited about? Just kind of a general question. It doesn't necessarily have to, be the HBO series.
Well, I am excited about the HBO series. That's one of the big things, and I've just returned from visiting the sets in Malta and in Belfast, Northern Ireland, where we have our principal soundstage. And I've watched some of the filming, and it's seen some of the rough footage, and as far as I can tell, it's going great. So, we have a few more months till hopefully that debuts, and that's exciting. And I'm also excited about the fact that I'm almost, I hope, finished with this damn book. I've been writing, since the dawn of time, and it would be very nice to get that gigantic monkey off my back and hopefully turn in a book that the readers will enjoy. Although, of course, I know already with the a grim foreknowledge that I will turn in a book and it will be published. And the day it comes out, I will get the first email saying, when's the next one coming out? That's what's waiting for me. I'm not naive about that. So.
Yeah, I'd say, with your books, I was a senior in high school when I read Game of Thrones in 96, I think.
Yep.
And I have been following it ever since. When I found out there was a card game, I was like, "Oh, what? You mean I can use these characters?" And it just kind of it steamrolled into that. How much kind of the reverse have you seen? People getting into the card game or into the role playing game and realizing, oh wow. This is huge, and
well, I think there's some. I have no hard statistics, but I think that's one of the cool things about doing these sub licenses, is that you get this kind of synchronicity where people encounter the card game first, or the board game, or the miniatures, or whatever, and they think it's cool, and then they start picking up the books. Mark, you might know more about that than I do. Do you have any knowledge of how many people start with the games and go on to the books?
Only a personal anecdote and me, but no hard statistics, I'm afraid, no.
When I first started getting these offers for sub rights, for card games and for board games and, for other spin-off products like that, I was really of two minds about whether to accept any of them. Because, on the one hand, I'm kind of a geek, and I was all thrilled by the idea of having little miniatures, my characters, and having these games and all of that stuff. But then there's another part of me that's a pretentious, serious artist, and I was saying, well, wait a minute, is this cheap merchandising? I'm trying to work a work of literature here that would be, hopefully stand the test of time, and it's probably my magnum opus. Do I want to commercialize it here? What would F. Scott Fitzgerald would never have, sold these rights and all that. But then I actually thought about it for a while. I said, F. Scott Fitzgerald never got an offer. I bet you, knowing F. Scott, if someone had come to him and said, we want to do Great Gatsby action figures, he would have signed on the moment. And he and Zelda would have gone on another jolly vacation to Paris or whatever. So I decided to go ahead and not worry about it. But I do think it has worked out well because it brings people to the books, and the books bring people to games, and everything brings people to everything else. And hopefully the HBO series will bring people to the games and the books and the miniatures and the whole shebang.
Yeah. You're obviously one of the real big, great fantasy authors of our time. You got people like you and Robert Jordan. I don't know if you've ever met like some of the newcomers like Brandon Sanderson, people like that. What's your opinion on just like the new guard of fantasy authors, I guess?
I've met, I go to science fiction conventions regularly and have since the 1970s, Worldcon in particular, and then various regional conventions every year. So the science fiction fantasy writers form a community, and we kind of all know each other for the most part, as long as you go to conventions. There are a few who don't, but so yeah, I've met Brandon Sanderson, I know Joe Abercrombie, Daniel Abraham is a good friend of mine. I've met Scott Lynch, some of the others I haven't met, but I've exchanged an occasional email with. This is a great time for fantasy, I think. There's tons of terrific new fantasy coming out. There's also tons of not so terrific new fantasy coming out, but that's always been the case. It's Sturgeon's law. So you have to find the good writers among the less good writers. But epic fantasy is riding high. And I think there's some terrific new people coming out right now. I think Joe Abercrombie is really first rate. Scott Lynch, his Lies of Loch Lamora was a terrific thing, and Daniel Abraham, who completed his Long Price Quartet 4-volume series. I think he did the entire 4 books while I've been struggling with this one book, God damn him. And now he's launched on a new series called The Dagger and the Coin, which I think is, I've read the first book of that, and it's going to be a sock thumper. It's a terrific series.
I actually haven't read it, and thank you for the recommendation. I'll go check it out. Speaking of...
One more.
Okay. Well, speaking of some of these other authors, and you mentioned, the wide variety of things that you've read over the years. I'm sure a certain amount of bleed or cool ideas come back and forth, but has there been anything as you've been writing that you've kind of gone, wait a minute, this is something that happened in book X that I read. Maybe I ought to, pass or change that.
I'm not sure you're...
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm getting my question across there.
I think it was one where if there's like a scene or a character that you have maybe inadvertently drawn inspiration from other works.
Yeah, yes. A certain amount of that I assume just kind of happens organically because, you're exposed to other things.
To my knowledge, I don't take anything from other people's fantasies. I do plunder freely from history. Mm-hmm. I'm constantly reading popular histories, and, my lady Paris is I'm always looking up and saying, you can't make this stuff up. And I find some incident or some anecdote that's just so incredibly visceral and vivid that, it's just amazing. And I included in my book. But I usually, once again, change it. I mean, the most conspicuous example, I won't go into details, but there's an incident in the third book called The Red Wedding, which is very loosely inspired by a real incident in Scottish history called the Black Dinner. But if you read about the Black Dinner and you read about my Red Wedding, you'll see they're very different, but the Black Dinner inspired the Red Wedding. So,
Well, great. That's fair. Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
All right, and you want me to say that I'm listening to Bear Swarm?
Yes. Just
okay. I'm listening and I'm talking here on Bear Swarm. This is George R. R. Martin on Bear Swarm.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Great. Now you all bears on the same phone.
That was actually from